You may have heard about child abuse and neglect. Do you know what they mean? They include acts of commission and omission and are preventable. Child abuse and neglect include acts of commission and omission. What are acts of commission? Acts of commission are deliberate and intentional. However, harm to a child might not be the intended consequence. Some examples include physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse. What are acts of omission? Acts of omission are the failure to provide for a child's basic physical, emotional, or educational needs, or to protect the child from harm or potential harm. Some examples include physical neglect, emotional neglect, medical and dental neglect, educational neglect, inadequate supervision, exposure to violent environments. About 1 in 7 children experience some form of child abuse or neglect in the last year. But we know the problem is underreported. That's why a consistent definition is so important. The good news is, we can stop child abuse and neglect before it starts. What can we do? We can work together to promote safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments so all children reach their full potential. Some strategies to consider include strengthen economic supports to families, change social norms to support parents and positive parenting, provide quality care and education early in life, enhance parenting skills to promote healthy child development, intervene to lessen harms and prevent future risk. These strategies help create families, neighborhoods, and communities where every child thrives.
Throughout this presentation, we are going to be talking about the effect that maltreatment, abuse, and neglect has on the development of children. You will learn that abuse and neglect affects not only children in their infancy or toddlers or as young adults, but starting from even when the time that they are a fetus up until adulthood, into their adult lives, abuse and neglect has a huge effect on any individual. We will discuss the different developmental stages of children. So starting in pregnancy and birth, from birth to 1 year, 1 to 4 years, 4 to 8 years, 8 to 12 years, adolescence, and then talk about the overall effects of development, maltreatment, and a child's resiliency. Throughout these different stages, you're going to learn about how neglect can be detrimental to each stage. Even before the birth of the child, the future relationship between the child and the parent is determined. With that being said, factors play into how this child is going to be accepted into the world. For example, was the birth of this child planned? Was it hoped for? Was this anticipation healthy? Was the child a replacement for another child? Was it a last effort to fix a marriage? Was the pregnancy a mistake? Is this baby a dreaded inconvenience? How does the parent's culture view the pregnancy? Was the child an accident? Different things like this determine already the world in which the child comes into. Let's say, for example, a child was conceived mistakenly or on accident and was unwanted and unplanned. This already sets the child up to experience neglect because, for example, the mother may not be emotionally ready to be a mother. She may not have the financial means to provide for a child. As well, the father, if he did not want to participate in the raising of this child, it sets the child up to be neglected not only as a fetus, but then in later years in life. And so as you can see, from the time the child is a fetus, it can already experience neglect. And this neglect can be detrimental to the child as he starts to develop. We also have to take into perspective the fact that different cultures have different ideas and definitions of what neglect looks like within the culture. There was a story shared in the textbook about a young Indian girl that came to America to get an education, and she was living with a host family, and the host family had just barely had a baby and put the baby in the crib starting at like 1 month old. And she was horrified at the fact that a baby would sleep alone, and she confronted her host family about it and talked about how she thought that this was abusive, because where she grew up in India, babies slept with their parents until they were about 5 years old. And so what we define as neglect differs throughout different cultures. And each of these forms of neglect within each culture affects the development of the child differently. Once the child is born and is no longer a fetus, there are certain behaviors that the average child will exhibit throughout different phases of his or her infancy throughout the development. These developmental milestones are dependent usually on the experience that the child has with the relationship between him or her and the primary caregiver, which is typically the mother. So different milestones like crawling, walking, eating, certain things like that will be able to develop typically in a normal process, as long as there is not abuse and neglect in the home, or the child is not receiving neglect from its primary caregiver. Some of these milestones defined in the book can be seen in the following video.
Monthly baby milestones. Your children may be able to start crawling on his or her 6th month of age, but others may not even be able to roll over from their tummy yet. The development stages of every child are different, but theoretically, babies will follow these milestones throughout their first year of life at their own pace. 1-month-old baby milestones. Notices faces, sees bold patterns, especially in black and white, recognizes the sound of your voice, starts to coo and make sounds beyond a simple cry, brings his hands within range of his eyes and mouth, moves his head side to side when lying on his stomach. 2-month-old baby milestones. Starts to recognize people at a distance and smile. Begins to follow things with eyes. Briefly calms herself, may bring her hands to her mouth to self-soothe. Begins to get fussy and acts bored if the activity doesn't change. Holds her head up. Begins to push up when lying on her tummy. Makes smoother movements with her arms and legs. 3-month-old baby milestones. Can distinguish your face from others. Starts to have different cries for different needs. Hunger, diaper change, pain. Opens and shuts hands. Turns his head away to express boredom. Swipes at dangling objects. Follows moving objects with his eyes. Turns his head in the direction of sounds. Enjoys playing with other people and may cry when the playing stops. 4-month-old baby milestones. Starts to giggle and laugh, copies facial expressions, reaches for a toy with one hand, holds her head steady, unsupported, pushes up onto her elbows when she's lying on her tummy. 5-month-old baby milestones. Rolls over from tummy to back, explores toys by putting them in his mouth, babbles, loves to look at himself in a mirror, entertains himself for short periods of time. 6-month-old baby milestones. Starts creeping along the floor. Starts sitting unaided. Passes things from one hand to the other. Starts to understand simple words. Responds to her name. 7-month-old baby milestones. Enjoys dropping things on the floor. Plays simple games like peekaboo. Begins to respond to no. Finds partially hidden objects. 8-month-old baby milestones. Begins crawling. Stands while holding on to something. Develops a pincer grasp using the thumb and index finger. 9-month-old baby milestones. May be wary of strangers and clings to familiar people. Has favorite toys. Makes a lot of different sounds like mama and ba 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 ba. copies sounds and gestures of others, uses fingers to point at things. 10-month-old baby Milestones explores things in different ways, like shaking, banging and throwing, pulls to stand, starts cruising, shuffling along while holding onto furniture, gets into a sitting position without help, begins feeding herself finger food thanks to better hand-eye coordination. 11-month-old baby Milestones understands object permanence, crawls up the stairs while supervised, makes sounds with changes in tone, sounds more like speech, develops separation anxiety. 12-month-old baby Milestones responds to simple spoken requests and directions, uses basic gestures like shaking his head, no, or waving, bye-bye, says mama and dada, and exclamations like uh-oh, looks at the right image or object when it's named, starts to use things correctly, for example, drinks from a cup or brushes his hair, may stand alone, may take a few steps without holding on.
It is proven that children do not develop properly when they grow up in an abusive or neglectful home. In fact, this starts even from the age of 6 months to 12 months, and it's shown that children who are not sufficiently stimulated develop failure to thrive syndrome, where they withdraw, they become quiet, they are not as socially responsive as other 6 to 12 months old children. They're extremely passive. Some of them develop separation anxiety from their parents. So when a parent leaves and they don't recognize the person in the room with them, they experience anxiety. It is at this age that children start to develop a sense of trust, and they start to trust their parents. But if they don't have consistency and are regularly neglected, a sense of mistrust becomes obvious in abused children.
All right, so today I will be touching on the age group of ages 1 to 4 and 8 to 12. And as I was reading the introduction of this chapter, I came across a lot of interesting points and a lot of things that I can relate to. But before I can get to that, I just wanted to point out in the introduction where it says this, and I quote, "Healthy development requires consistent guidance on the part of the adults in the child's world, an experience not always available to abused and neglected children." Let me just reclarify that. Healthy development requires consistent guidance on the part of the adults. So it's important for adults to guide their child, to give them the attention that they need to grow. It is important in a child's world. However, this is not the case for all children who have abusive parents and who neglects them. This is not what happens to them, and it's sad, but this is the truth. And I just want to go through the effects of how maltreatment, how abuse, how neglect, how it can destroy a child. The effects of it. According to the textbook, it says those who experience abuse and neglect will show little interest in having relationship with anybody. This affects their personality, how they will interact with other people when they grow up. They will not have any trust. They will lack trust in anybody, and they will fear to trust anybody around them because of their experience of neglect. And they will lack a lot of confidence, and they wouldn't feel free to do what they want to do, to be what they want to be. And normally sexually abused children end up doing the same thing that they went through, or they were abused, apply the things that they did and went through with their abuser, to the peers, to those around them. So this issue doesn't only affect them, it affects everybody around them. It affects the community. And it's a cycle. It's a cycle that's been going on for many years. It's a generational curse that needs to end. And the sad part is, it's not the parents' fault that they are the way they are, because it could be something that has been in their family for so long. I know in the Polynesian culture, there's a lot of things that are different, especially when it comes to dealing with these sort of cases. The most saddest thing is, normally, typically, if you're to ask Tongan how a rapist is or someone who got raped is dealt with, if the daughter or if the child complains to their parents, or they admit to their parents that something had happened to them, and they confide to their parents that someone tried to rape them or they got raped, the parents, high percentage of chance that the parents do not stand with their own child. They will believe, or not necessarily believe, they will just shove everything under the carpet and just tell the child to move on like it was nothing, forgetting that the experience that the child had is traumatizing and can literally ruin her forever. Yet they're so prideful and they care more about their reputation and what others might say, so they silence the problem, and this generational curse continues because nobody is able to admit or tell of the abuser that what they are doing is wrong. And it's very sad. It's sad because it still happens in the world today. And it's sad because it happened to this group, this age group, 1 year to 4 years. That's just, I don't know how to explain or to understand how this is an issue that's ongoing. And as I continue to read the textbook, I noticed in the ages of 4, the abused and neglectful child demonstrates difficulty in relating to others. Like I said earlier, they don't trust anybody because they didn't, they didn't have that sort of relationship and bond with their parents, and they just, because of how they were treated by their parents, it's like normal for them. Like they think that that's how life is supposed to be, that because they're neglected, that that's what they should do to other people. They shouldn't care. It's just because of what they experience. And it's sad. It's sad that what they think is normal is actually not normal. And this all happens because of their parents being abusive or their parents being neglectful. And all cultures raise their children differently, but I strongly do not believe that it's fair for a child to go through or to be raised in a home where the parents neglect them, because it does ruin their future. It does ruin the person that child is meant to be.
Now remember how I told you that Jenny never seemed to want to go home? Well, she lived in a house that was old as Alabama. Her mama had gone up to heaven when she was 5, and her daddy was some kind of a farmer.
Jenny?
He was a very loving man. He was always kissing and touching her and her sisters. And then this one time, Jenny wasn't on the bus to go to school.
King, why'd you come to school today? Shh. Daddy's taking a nap.
Jenny!
Come on.
Jenny! Where'd you run to? You better get back here, girl! Where you at? Jenny! Jenny! Where you at? Jenny!
Pray with me, Forrest. Pray with me.
Jenny!
Dear God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far, far away from here. Dear God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far, far away from here.
Mama always said that God is mysterious.
Jenny!
He didn't turn Jenny into a bird that day.
Get back here!
Instead, he had the police say Jenny didn't have to stay in that house no more. She went to live with her grandma just over on Creekmore Avenue, which made me happy because she was so close. Some nights, Jenny'd sneak out and come on over to my house just because she said she was scared. Scared of what? I don't know. But I think it was her grandma's dog. He was a mean dog. Anyway, Jenny and me was best friends all the way up through high school.
The next age we are going to discuss is children between the ages of 4 and 8 years old. Developmental delays continue to be obvious in these ages due to the fact that the hallmark of this period of time should be their learning. But children whose early development have been affected by abuse or neglect may not have the sufficient energy or interest for their education or learning. So these children come to school unable to trust their teachers, and the success of education oftentimes depends on the quality of a teacher-child relationship. So when a child comes to school unable to trust, obviously they aren't able to understand and trust their teacher. As well, the relationships with their peers are frequently poor. Typically, by age 8, children should be able to understand the concept of cause and effect, but abused children, they're not able to, and cause and effect relationships are not clear. This is because the abused child has no consistency due to neglect. It's also hard for the child to take in so much verbal communication and explanations by a teacher. A child may be used to one-word commands at home, so an abusive or neglectful parent might only say no or stop or get this or things like that, and they're not used to explanations from an adult. And so their mind is underdeveloped, and when they get to school, they are preoccupied with everything a teacher is trying to explain to them. They have almost like a verbal overload that they have a hard time grasping cognitive material. Another way in which a small child is affected is their inability to develop a superego. And so typically when a 4 to 8 year old goes to school, they have an internal set of morals that they've learned from their parents, like different rules of games or the rules of life, so to say. And when they get to school, these sort of morals that they're supposed to know are typically hazy for abused and neglected children, because their parents didn't hold them to a certain moral standard between the ages of 4 to 8. On the opposite end of the spectrum to that is a child developing an extremely high sense of superego out of the fear of abuse. So a child may come and he's super rigid because he's scared to fail, because failure in his home or not complying or not meeting expectations brings abuse. And so this child fears abuse, so he demonstrates an intense need to succeed in his schoolwork because failure is totally unacceptable.
All right, so now moving on to the ages of 8 to 12 years old. And I strongly believe that this part of the chapter really hits home for me. There are parts in this chapter where I can relate to the most in this chapter. But before I do so, in sharing my experiences, I just wanted to point out that for a child who is in this age group, growing up in a home where the parents is abusive and neglectful, they normally assume household tasks and they lack participation in peer activities and they cater to parental whims. So basically, they have no life, if I would put it into that word. Description is they literally have no life. They don't get the opportunity to interact with peers, to have friends, because their life revolves around going to school and just coming straight home. There's no such thing as going out and having fun with friends or taking days off. So everything in their life just revolves around their parents and what the parents want for them. And it's sad because those who go through such experience in their life feel that it's normal. It's normal to be that way, that it's part of life and that's just part of how life is supposed to be. And it's sad. And they don't get the opportunity to feel affection or love or the way that we see parents should be treating their child, because what they see is what they think that's how it's supposed to be. And it's sad, and it's sad that it's happening. It's actually happening. And another point that I wanted to state is that a child who is living this sort of life doesn't get the opportunity to grow the way they're supposed to grow. Rather, they have to grow up real fast. They have to be able to look after their siblings. They have to take charge. They have to do things that adults have to do. And one example that I would just like to point out is in the textbook it says, it is important to note that some cultures expect that their children will care for younger siblings at an early age. So this very part of the chapter relates to me because I remember when I was around eight to 9 years old, my parents would tell me to look after my siblings and they would just have to go somewhere. And normally when I was young, I would think that it's normal to stay home and just watch the kids while my parents have to run and do errands. But as I grew older, I came to an understanding that it is not okay, that you have to be a certain age to be at home to do what I did. And I remember it's because it wasn't because my parents neglected us. It was just the way my parents wanted us to help protect one another, especially when they needed to make ends meet. Coming from the islands, they don't get the opportunities that those who were born and raised in a foreign country get. So they had to try their very best to work several jobs to make ends meet, even if it took them a lot of their times away from us. But I didn't see it was neglect. I saw it was their way of loving us to do what they did, to sacrifice everything that they had, that their time with us, just so they can go find ways to provide for us financially. And that was just how I thought life was supposed to be. But see, that's my culture, and then that's how we were raised. And another part is that I just felt very disgusted. But it happens is incestuous affair. And in the textbook, it clearly states that there's a role reversal, and it happens when the mother has to go work, and then the oldest daughter steps up and does what a mother is supposed to do in a home. And then the role is reversal. The abusive father would see the daughter as the mother and will abuse her sexually. And it's sad because it's real. It happens. It happens in today's world. It doesn't only happen in the movies. It happens, and there's many victims out there who are scared to tell their moms. They're afraid to open up because they know it will literally kill their mother. It will kill their mom's heart. It will just destroy the family. But instead they choose silence. And they choose silence because they're afraid. It's fear is stronger than faith to them. That they literally are like in the dark. And it's sad because coming from someone who knows how it feels to be in the dark for many years, I don't know how I did it, how I kept silence from my experience of being sexually assaulted at a young age, in such a young age, that I don't want anyone to go through what I went through. That I thought that being silent was the way to go, and that battling it on my own was the way to go. But no, it's not. It's not okay for the abuser to think it's okay to abuse. It's not okay for them to think that life goes on after they traumatize a child. It is not okay that they feel that incest relationship is good. It's not okay for them to take advantage of a child's life. It is not okay for abuser to feel that they could do whatever they want to anybody's life and just move on with theirs like they didn't do anything. And although sad, it is for those who end up in prison because of this, it is something that they caused upon themselves. And a child who goes through this, it doesn't only like stay with them in just their childhood, it actually carries on to their adulthood, and it can really either refine a person where they makes them stronger, or it can literally destroy a life. And it's destroyed many lives, and it needs to stop, and it needs to stop today.
When a child is used in any way for the sexual arousal of an adult or another child, whether through touching behaviors or non-touching behaviors, like exhibitionism or showing pornography, that child has been sexually abused. Sometimes the abuse is disguised as a game, and very often the abuser is a close family member or other supposedly trusted person. In any case, the trauma of sexual abuse has profound impacts on a child's development, psychologically, socially, and physically. Children who've been sexually abused will often behave differently than their peers. They may appear to space out or be hyperactive. They may have angry outbursts, frequent nightmares, learning problems, or knowledge of sex inappropriate to their age. While some victims will become withdrawn, others act aggressively or bully other children. Sometimes their behaviors become so troublesome that social service agencies or the police are called in. Studies show the prevalence of childhood sexual abuse to be between 30 to 40% for girls and 20 to 30% for boys. These children are traumatized during periods of their development essential to building healthy relationships, coping skills, and feelings of safety and self-worth. Sexual abuse can do considerable damage in these areas, damage that can last a lifetime if untreated. The ongoing effects can include post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, substance abuse, interpersonal issues, and pervasive feelings of insecurity, shame, and distrust. But there is hope. Whether the abuse is discovered by a caregiver right away or an adult survivor decides it's time to get help, specific therapies and treatment approaches can enable a victim of childhood sexual trauma to lead a full, satisfying, and healthy life. A child who is sexually abused needs reassurance that he is believed, is not to blame, and will be kept safe from further harm. For the adult survivor, treatment may include group and individual therapy, stress management training, education, and learning new coping skills. Regardless of when the abuse is recognized, please know that it is never too late to get help. The National Child Abuse Hotline can provide assistance by calling 1-800-4-A-CHILD. In the event of immediate danger, call 911.
First of all, I want to thank Via for sharing that. I can only imagine that could be kind of scary to be vulnerable and to share your story. And I appreciate you being open with us about this, because part of this chapter is talking about, how kids are affected by abuse and neglect and how it affects their development. And the next age we're going to talk about is kids who are experiencing adolescence, so their teen years. Sexual abuse has really detrimental effects on teenagers. To start with teenage girls, it affects their ability, and I would guess teenage boys too, it affects their abilities to form relationships. The way that they view themselves and their perception of sex in a relationship is very skewed. It doesn't allow them to form trusting relationships because in a lot of their relationships, the relationship with their abuser, they were manipulated, maybe emotionally abused as well. And so it severely affects the ability in the teen years to create relationships. Another thing it affects is body image. Body image is a huge part of adolescence, right? This is the time when you're learning what your identity is, how you fit in with others. And those who are sexually abused, they have misconceptions and really negative views about themselves. In fact, it's seen that a lot of sexual abuse victims develop eating disorders like anorexia or bulimia, things like this. In this chapter of the book, it mentions two psychologists, Finkelhor and Brown, who share their studies of finding that sexual abuse has 4 types of traumatic effects. The first is traumatic sexualization. The second is betrayal. Third is powerlessness. And fourth is stigmatization. Traumatic sexualization occurs because the child was exposed to sexual behavior at an inappropriate level of development. Sometimes he or she was rewarded for participating in the activity. And so the now adolescents will use sexual activity to manipulate others or to meet his or her need. Promiscuity is often a part of an abused adolescent's pattern. As the adolescent continues to develop, he or she learns that what their perpetrator did was abuse and neglect. And they start to realize that this adult, this individual, betrayed them, betrayed their trust, took their trust away. And so the adolescent starts to feel betrayed by the victim. And the sense of betrayal that's felt by the adolescent is profound, and it contributes a lot of the times to self-abusive or rebellious behavior.
Families carry trauma throughout their lives and they pass it on to their children, and unfortunately it then gets passed on to their children. And so every child that you're able to help, you're minimizing that.
Traditionally, we've always thought when we see a kid, what's wrong with you? And the shift of thinking at KVC, which I think is amazing, is what happened to you.
Trauma affects children differently. It's a hard term to define, but it's something that impacts the child. That means their behaviors change because of it.
All children react very differently to different traumas, just like people do.
These kids with trauma, it reacts the same way that they see that a soldier's brain reacts to, that has had PTSD.
The brain is basically a mirror of the environment that the child has been in.
The other thing is trauma is a difficult topic to talk about. It's painful, it's scary, it's hurtful. And so one of the complicating factors from trauma is that people who've experienced trauma tend to want to avoid it.
Well, these kids, the person that was supposed to be nurturing them, to trust them, that they were sexually molested by them, they were physically abused by them. They saw these people who were supposed to nurture them getting drugs or taken away by the police or taken away from them home or being neglected in somehow. And so, so when they see an authority figure, they're not going to react the same way because their authority figure never gave them the nurturing and the trusting environment that each kid deserves.
And so one of the things that we say is it's not a behavior problem, it's a brain problem. They behave differently because their brain is functioning differently.
Over 50% of the people in the general population have had their own trauma experience, and so it doesn't necessarily get the attention that it deserves because it's a difficult topic to talk about.
We work a lot with kids who have different levels of trauma, and it's important for all of our staff to be trauma informed as well as our foster parents to also be trauma informed so that we can help kids during the healing process.
Because mental health is never just a patient illness, it's a family illness.
We need to start working when the children are young to help prevent trauma, to help strengthen families, strengthen parents to be their child's best teacher, so then when those kids grow up, they can raise their kids in a better way.
KVC's message is, let's get involved, because children and young people and their lives should matter to all of us.
And we are all responsible for these kids, not just DCF, not just KVC, but we are as a population and society.
When they finally buy into the tools and have that toolbox for life that they can pick from and use, then they can go about the healing process.
We're living the dream. Every day we're out there fighting and advocating for the children that are in need.